Good day and welcome to this Commonwealth of Learning webinar entitled Modes of Teaching and Learning Opportunities for Deliberate Design, to be presented by COL Chair Dr. Mark Nichols. Mark is the Executive Director of Learning Design and Development with the Open Polytechnic Te Pūkenga in New Zealand. Apart from being a COL Chair in ODL, he's also the President of ICDE. He has extensive experience across ODL and hosts the Leaders and Legends of Online Learning podcast. Dear colleagues, feel free to pose questions in the Q&A or chat, and these questions will be handled at the end of the presentation. Mark, thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Pleasure, thanks Jaco, and good day everyone. I'll start with a welcome. Kia ora koutou, nau mai haere mai. Ka Aotearoa te whenua e rū ana taku nākau. Kaua te kaiwhakahaere mātua o te tari whakapakari akoranga ki te kurutini tuwhera. Ko Mark Nichols, tōku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. My pepeha, or personal introduction in Te Reo Māori, welcomes you and introduces me as someone who loves Aotearoa, New Zealand. As Jaco said, I'm Executive Director of Learning Design and Development at Open Polytechnic and a Commonwealth of Learning Chair with a specific focus on modes of teaching and learning. Now, what I'm presenting on here is the first step in what I hope to be a larger project, investigating different modes of teaching and learning so that we can be more deliberate in our design of educational opportunities and systems. It's actually a really difficult piece of work. It's not made any easier by the ways in which we tend to think about teaching and learning. So by way of illustrating that, I'd like to start by having you think of a car. So please take a moment now to develop a mental picture of a car, imagining its color, style, interior, where the driver sits. Try to get as much detail in mind as possible. So try and fuse that image of a car in your mind. And then let me show you what a generic car looks like, DALL-E style. So according to AI, at the time I made the request, this is actually what a car looks like. Now, I wonder if the color of your own image was the same, whether yours had a roof rack, 4 doors, an open bonnet. One of the most difficult things around what I'm going to be talking about, and also one of the greatest barriers to what I'm investigating, is the incredibly casual language we tend to apply to modes of teaching and learning. We use terms like blended, high flex, hybrid, flipped, and online, none of which are any easier to agree on than what a generic car might look like. But we use these terms frequently, and we often mean very different things when we do so. So I've written about this recently. I don't want to get too hung up on that, but I think it describes why it's so important to try to further define modes of teaching and learning. So if we find it difficult to define a car, well, how should we approach the concept of teaching? I mean, this is actually central to what we all hold in common. Well, according to Britannica.com, and this is a common enough definition, teaching is the profession of those who give instruction. But how useful is this? So I'll pause to give you opportunity just to compose your own definition and to give some time for you to share your definition in chat. So if you wouldn't mind, just give some thought as to how you define teaching and put some thoughts in chat. Just curious to see what we might get from you all. So what is teaching? How would you define it? So facilitating, yep. The art and science of helping others learn. Yep, brilliant, Tony, thanks. Nice to see you. Teaching is sharing knowledge and skills in a structured way. Great. The process of facilitation to support learning. Excellent. Okay, so some very, very good definitions there. I'm not surprised given the caliber of folk who are no doubt out there. So here are 2 definitions that I'm fond of, mainly because they're mine. I've taken both a pragmatic and more idealistic approach in my 2 suggestions here. So the first comes from work I've done in the area of operating model development. Now, no matter what our personal ideals or preferences for teaching practice might be, it is always subject to an institution's operating model. So that you might work in semesters, have lectures, and are required to have office hours is seldom your choice. It's part of the way the organization works. It's part of the operating model. That you might have 100 learners in your class means one-on-one might just be impossible for you, even if you really do believe in it pedagogically. So pedagogy is not the only partner in the dance of teaching. How we exercise the teaching role is always shaped by policy and institutional practice. So I've referred to it in my first definition as a dance, even though it might from time to time resemble more of a mosh pit than a ballet. My second definition is much more idealistic, and it's based on the observation by Parker Palmer that the role of the teacher is to give the subject its voice. Now, this doesn't necessarily require someone talking to you about the subject or teaching you didactically. A subject might gain its voice through a video, a book, a reading, or a simulation. As long as the subject has an opportunity to express itself, teaching's taken place. So, across these definitions, I've separated the concept of teaching from the identity of a teacher. Now, this is a really important starting point for what follows. Not all teaching requires an identifiable teacher. Put another way, an identifiable teacher doesn't have to be involved for teaching to have taken place. The main thing is that the learner encounters the voice of the subject. Now, oddly, the Dali image here seems to capture this. There's no physical classroom. One person seems to be learning from what they're involved with on their laptop, and the other looks to be reflecting on some sort of activity involving a dustpan. Let's switch our attention now to the partner of teaching, learning. This again is my own definition based on a book by Kamler and Thompson. It describes learning as a smudge, something that's not really definable, but that illustrates the change in knowing in ways that mean we know more. So it could apply to a skill or understanding, just basically getting better at something. So learning is a smudge between a self that knows to a self that knows more. To learn then is to be personally smudged from one state of learning to another. As knowers, we are forever incomplete. There is always more to know, more to be smudged. So I start with these terms teaching and learning because they're fundamental to any mode of education. I think we need to be broad in our understanding of these terms. Otherwise, we might think of them only in the context of what we're familiar with. And this can limit our sense of what's possible and also what's legitimate. So coming back to my opening activity, even though you have a particular car in mind, there are other forms of vehicle on the road, and we need to share. It's important that our breadth of what it means to teach and learn includes skills in the workplace, concepts in the classroom, and insights from reflection. So these might come from a teacher's explanation, observing someone else, or simply by reading something. So with all that in mind, let me introduce you to the project and its progress to date. So the project started about 2 years ago when Dr. Caroline Seelig and I started looking at different delivery modes that the open, distance, and flexible learning model of the Open Polytechnic might support as part of a new network of delivery. So Te Pūkenga, the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, started taking shape in 2022. Its mission was to bring together all vocational education from 16 regional institutes of technology and polytechnics and 9 industry training organizations to bring them together into a single network. Now, this network's required by legislation to bring together on the job, face to face, and distance delivery options for vocational education across all regions of New Zealand. Now, I need to point out that Te Pūkenga is now being disestablished, but that's not really important for the integrity of the presentation or the importance of this work. The point is that all of this bringing together of different institutions focused attention on how a single network of provision might operate that brings together very different models of teaching and learning. It also got us wondering about what other modes of teaching and learning might be out there, which other ones might exist, that perhaps combine or even stretch these 3 models in different directions. What really motivated us, though, was just how misunderstood different modes of teaching and learning are. I mean, what after all's open and distance learning? What's blended learning? What, for that matter, is work-based learning? And are there opportunities for these to be combined or work together in clever ways? So the establishment of Te Pūkenga forced the question of how on-the-job, face-to-face and distance delivery might be considered as options for one single provider. Now, typically institutions tend to focus on just a single mode or small variants of one of these. So thinking about how these might interrelate from a single operating model was an interesting exercise. So I started investigating and I quickly found out that there's no such thing as a single on-the-job delivery mode. So the only thing the 9 industry training organization representatives I talked with agreed upon was that their mode was fluid. So it was very different across all 9. The only thing they agreed on was, hey, fluidity isn't common. I also know that there are many, many ways of legitimately practicing distance education, even though we use the same term to describe them all. So even across these three major categories on the slide, we're clearly not talking about three neat approaches to teaching and learning that can be easily pulled apart. There are actually multiple modes of delivery. And even though they might at first appear quite separate, there's a great deal of potential in mixing them and also developing other possibilities through new combinations. In New Zealand, tertiary education is funded by a government agency called the Tertiary Education Commission, or the TEC. There are 5 different funding categories listed toward the bottom of the slide that you can see there. And these are similar to those legislated for Te Pūkenga: provider-based or face-to-face, extramural or distance, and work-based learning, which equates to on the job. And there's 2 other ones there too: pathways to work and assessment and verification. But as with the 3 Te Pūkenga categories, these ignore a significant volume of innovative and flexible modes of education that can extend these in brand new directions. So at the heart of my project is the commitment that legislation and funding should not be the basis of teaching and learning practice. If anything, we should start with learner needs and the best ways to make education accessible and inclusive. So our starting point is how we might best describe education opportunities to extend access and to extend inclusivity for learners. So with teaching and learning in mind, these are the benefits for institutions in actually defining modes of teaching and learning, taking that time to define them. First off, it can assist in decision making. It does this by making deliberate teaching and learning decisions rather than just assuming the default ones. So teaching and learning always take place in a system which involves enrollment, success services, financial modeling, teaching roles. If different modes can be easily identified and compared, they can also be selected and applied when it makes sense to do so. So as an extension of this, defining modes can also enable us to properly evaluate and share good practice. Now, this is really vital because you'll often come across articles claiming to share best teaching practice, but these are usually based on someone's particular education model or sense of what a car is. And these can be entirely meaningless across different modes of education. So as an example, I wonder whether you agree with the question that's now on the slide. Are peer relationships across learners a requirement for effective learning? Well, it's a common enough claim, but from years of asynchronous distance education practice, I can tell you that actually, no, it's not the case. It's complete nonsense. And insisting on it can actually ruin valuable education modes. Now, it's a nice to have, but not a necessary component for effective teaching and learning across all models. Peer relationships make perfect sense when they're possible, and some excellent education design can be made that includes it. But whether the practice of peer relationships is a requirement for effective learning rests on the mode of teaching and learning a learner is engaged in, and whether any requirement for peer relationships becomes a barrier to access. Now, I've seen the importance of peer relationships result in some fairly tragic examples of pedagogical practice, and thinking here in particular of the early MOOCs. So improved decision making is one benefit. Shared terminology and shared practice can also make analytics in comparison more meaningful because you're talking about the same thing. The same modes of education applied in different situations can be compared next to one another so that practice can be improved based on true comparable evidence. We don't really have this at present. I mean, as an example, my version of online learning might be completely different to yours. So comparing our two models and trying to learn from one another might make very little sense, even though we might use the same term to describe them. Finally, identifying modes of teaching and learning can assist strategic planning and education systems design. So as an example, consider a degree program offered across a national network of regional campuses, also offered through work-based learning and a distance education function. Now, there's no need for the same program to be offered in exactly the same way everywhere. It may be possible to have multiple modes of delivery for the same program available to learners, so that they've got more and better choice in how they learn from where they are. So with the right thinking, a national network of delivery can be planned drawing on the same basic materials, even if they're experienced by learners in very different ways, depending on the delivery mode they're a part of, based on their circumstances. So if you're a recent school leaver, well, a full-time study program on your local campus might be the best option. If you're on the job as a trainee, a more flexible model suitable for your workplace is preferred. But if you're unable to attend a campus because of distance or have dependents or can't commit to a regular schedule, an asynchronous distance model would be best. So being able to name and agree on the meaning of modes of teaching and learning makes planning for these different learners much easier and much more coherent. The most important phrase on this slide, though, is the one highlighted. Defining modes of teaching and learning means we're able to actually design education systems. So remember the dance between pedagogy and operating decisions as a definition of teaching. Well, this is where the music's scored. This is where we actually design the tune that we dance to. Okay, one last slide before describing the modes. These won't be without their controversy, so I want to make it really clear that I'm aware of the shortfalls of trying to nail these down and define them. So firstly, education takes place across so many contexts, and not all of the modes will apply to all situations, and there will be some missing from the list. There are multiple subject areas, multiple qualification levels ranging from foundation certificates through to PhD programs. There's multiple curriculum requirements that might require practicums, specific application of skills, some exams might be required. I get that. Education is complex, and the simple modes identified will need to flex. The second point restates what I addressed on the previous slide. Education systems are always designed. Now, sometimes it might not appear that way, but they are. Every teaching and learning situation makes assumptions about how teaching and learning ought to take place. So design is at the heart of this thinking. And you can't always template or cookie cutter a design, but you need to start somewhere. Design always involves some form of customization. Next, the modes are not comprehensive and they will overlap. So while the modes are listed as separate categories, in truth, the space between them is somewhat fluid. Excuse me for a moment. Now, there's a saying in the process of dissection, the patient dies. So if you try to get too much detail into things, if you try to separate things out too much across modes, you inadvertently destroy the magic that actually brings them to life. So the same logic applies to these modes I'm about to share. Most important, though, is the last disclaimer. We needed a way of providing some pivot point so that modes could be meaningfully categorized. And in the end, we opted for synchronicity, and that there's a binary between modes as to whether there's a timetable requirement in place or not. That's because whether there's a timetable in place, it's a foundational consideration for systems design and education. Because if a timetable is required, there are immediate assumptions made clear about the teaching and learning process. If there's no timetables, teaching and learning take place on a very different design. So as we'll see, the 10 different modes initially identified are characterized based on whether they are at heart asynchronous or synchronous in nature. And without further ado or disclaimer, here they are. Now at the top right of every slide in the corner, you'll see a link to a presentation format showing these in more detail. So that link's on every slide from here on, and I'll leave the link available from the last slide in this presentation too. So feel free to go to the URL for a more detailed look, because I won't be going into a lot of detail in each mode in this presentation. Instead, I'll just give you an overview and 2 examples from the 10. So there's 2 categories, asynchronous and synchronous, and 10 modes. And you'll see that the names aren't always helpful, but they are discrete. 4 of these modes are asynchronous and 6 are synchronous. And in terms of most to most, ODFL distance is considered the most asynchronous and live classroom is the most synchronous. And you'll see also many terms here that you're likely already familiar with. We've tried to make use of existing terms as much as possible while staying true to what they broadly seem to mean. Now, some of them might be intuitive. For example, a virtual class is like a live classroom with some added time flexibility through streaming. A roadshow is where synchronous learning opportunities are provided in different physical locations by the same team, which travel from place to place. Each of these models was in place to some extent across the 25 organizations that were combined to form Te Pūkenga. So each is possible. Each also has its own strengths and weaknesses, and not all might be appropriate for every subject or program. So the idea behind this list is that starting with your learner's context, the type of subject, and whether you have a local campus, there'll be a range of teaching and learning options that you can apply. So listing them as we've done here also shows that they're actually connected, and you can build upon and even strengthen them by building upon one another. Here's another way of viewing the 10 modes, this time in some sort of synchronicity spectrum. So those in blue here have more in common than those in red, and vice versa, because the underlying assumptions of teaching and learning are either synchronous or asynchronous. Now, I am aware of bicronous learning, the bicronous proposal. So forms of that are possible from this slide by selecting more than one mode. So it is possible to combine these in strategic ways, but I wouldn't consider bicronous as a single mode. I suggest it's made up of different selections from this particular slide that offer the learner more choice in either a synchronous or asynchronous format. So as an example, I'll take a business program we offer in Open Polytechnic through the OFDL distance mode. Now, the same courseware that's critical for making the OFDL mode possible might also serve as the basis for a local group mode, where a local teacher provides workshop-style sessions according to a timetable, building on those same materials developed for ODFL distance. So there are valid ways of mixing and enriching different modes of delivery if they're planned for. So let me briefly show you what this might look like. On the website, you'll see that each of the modes are described in terms of learner activity, teaching activity, resources required, timetable, and assessment. And you'll see the indicative questions associated with each of those on this slide. So part of defining the modes involved getting under the bonnet to see how they actually work in practice. And this is so very important because it makes the modes much more meaningful, and it also shows where crossover with other modes might be possible. So we've worked to describe each term not just with a label, but also critically with some further advice as to how they actually work in practice. So across these 5 parameters of learner activity, teaching activity, resources, timetable, and assessment, you can build up a fairly clear description of how things actually work. This detail is usually missing from the typical conversations we tend to have around modes of teaching and learning. It's also why you won't find online as a mode, because almost all of the modes listed before have some sort of online engagement. So if I described what I do as online, you'd have to assume which of the 10 modes here I actually mean. Another strength of having these 5 areas is that it future-proofs the list. So if a new mode of teaching and learning is developed, it can be defined according to these descriptive areas, and so find its place among the others. So a teaching and learning mode is defined in terms of what learners do, what teaching aligned roles do, the teaching and learning resources required for the mode to succeed, the timetable arrangements that must be in place, and how learners are assessed. So these demonstrate the design of the teaching and learning taking place, and also determine how the underlying systems and processes must work in order for that mode to be supported. So I'll finish now with 2 examples, starting with the first, the open, flexible, and distance learning distance mode. Now it's intentionally asynchronous, and then the descriptions for each of those 5 areas, you'll see how it works with a bit more detail. So the learner activity consists mainly of engaging with digital courseware. It doesn't need to be digital, but it's usually designed to support independent learning with no strict timetable at all. In fact, the course materials are designed in such a way that a learner might start their studies at any time, independent of any cohort. So it's independent as well. Depending on the subject, learning might also require practicums, simulations, and work-integrated opportunities. Now, some of these might require a schedule, but at heart, the mode is designed to be independent of time and place. You'll see there that the general teaching activity consists of academic support, subject representation, and updating courseware. So this model still requires academic staff, but not in the form of lecturing or even providing tutorials. The courseware shoulders the primary responsibility for the learning experience. The learning resources themselves then must be carefully and substantially designed. And developing these is the responsibility of my team at Open Polytechnic, and I'm really proud to say we do a totally thorough job. Now this mode does present unique challenges for assessment. Because it's a fully asynchronous mode, there's a necessity for assessment tasks to be both predetermined but also enduring as a deterrent for having students share answers with one another, and also to ensure that the work is the learner's own. So here you can see how the design of OFDL distance works in support of time and place independent learning and the importance of courseware to this mode. And you can also see that it can be adapted when practicums and work-integrated opportunities might be needed. My second and final example is the mode we call flexible. So this is a synchronous mode at heart, which might be available in classroom or at a distance, or it might even include local small groups. The mode here appears a little more open-ended than the OFDL one because the learner activity is less strictly described, but you can see that the teaching activity gives a good description of how this mode works. There's resources in the form of teacher notes, activities and presentations, and the teaching activity includes lecturing and tutoring. But critically, there's a timetable for learners to engage with, either live or virtually. Now, while this might also include recordings, there's still a reasonably firm schedule in place. So this mode gives a much more open-ended possibility for assessments as well, but they are still predetermined. So just from these two examples, you can see how the teaching and learning dynamics are quite different. The way you'd support an OFDL distance mode as an organization is very different to how you'd support a flexible one. The courseware might also be very different, and the role of teaching staff is very different. So the forms of learning analytics and support services, well, they'll also be very different across these two modes. So you can see how the mode for teaching and learning will also shape the administrative and IT services around them. So please do feel free to explore the variety of teaching modes linked to at the top right of the slide. There are some New Zealand te reo Māori terms in there, but hopefully they'll make sense to you all. So to close, look, I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand and articulate the teaching and learning mode you have in place and have designed to. Or if you're doing research around teaching and learning, it's really important you take the time to carefully define and describe the modes of teaching and learning you're assuming in your study. So unless you're confident in defining your teaching and learning mode, you'll have real difficulty in improving how it works. So I invite you to draw on the 10 modes we've identified. Either find yourself among them or else take the time to describe yours as a new one. I'm very interested in any new forms out there that might add to or refine the current list. The first step is to determine whether or not the mode you're dealing with is synchronous or asynchronous. And the best way to answer that is to determine whether or not there's a timetable or class schedule in place. If so, you're actually dealing with something that's synchronous. That should be fairly simple. In next steps for this work, I'm seeking to further refine the modes, identify some exemplars from around the world, and also explore the decision-making parameters that will help us better decide upon which modes we might want to apply in practice. I want to leave you with a question that's taking up more and more of my attention and thinking. So education is always designed. Teaching and learning activities always take place in response to a design for how education operates. How deliberate are we in those decisions? How often do we take the time to consider the relationships between learning, teaching, resources, timetable, and assessment, and whether they reflect the best design possible for learners? I sincerely hope you take that question away. So let me finish there. Thank you for your time. And if there's any questions, please do ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate this very interesting presentation. I think you made us reflect quite a lot on the different modes and the different implications they have for teaching and learning.